Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon, dedicated to the discussion of the tragic situation in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We are holding this special session during the evening of March 3rd, 2022, in the United States, and the morning of March 4th, 2022, in Europe and Africa. And as of this time, we are aware that tremendous devastation has already taken place, including the deaths of over 10,000 soldiers on both sides combined, thousands of civilians, a lot of buildings and infrastructure and works of art destroyed, and the standard of living of the Ukrainian people completely devastated, but also the standard of living of the Russian people completely devastated because of the effects of the economic sanctions and Russia's isolation from the world economy. And in the US Transhumanist Party, we are supporters of peace and de-escalation. We care deeply about reducing and eliminating existential risks to humanity. In fact, that is our third core ideal. We seek to use science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate existential risks to the human species. So we have a distinguished panel of US Transhumanist Party officers and members to help us gather insights today in order to resolve this terrible crisis and, most importantly, prevent its escalation into a world war and a nuclear war. We have with us our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our Director of Foreign Relations, Sharifuddin Ahmed Rana. We have our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. We have our Foreign Ambassador to Hong Kong, Pam Keefe, and our special guest is Ugochukwu Alo. Ugochukwu hails from Nigeria. He is a writer, political philosopher, human rights and climate change activist with a double degree in philosophy from Pontifical Urban University in Rome and Imo State University in Owerri, Nigeria. So welcome, Ugochukwu. You are known in Nigeria for your keen political insights and analysis regarding various current world events, and you have posted extensively on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Can you give us your analysis of what is happening in this conflict and how it can be de-escalated so that we can prevent the worst possible outcomes?
Wow, thank you so much for having me on the show. Quite it's early morning here in Nigeria, and I'm quite glad to feature in this awesome Transhumanist Party show. So first of all, I would say that the Russia-Ukrainian conflict is would be termed like an issue between brothers propagated to a global scale. Why both parties have can be said to be neighbors, the spirit of brotherhood, which should engender a kind of rapport between both parties, is intensively lacking. Yet citizens of both countries will identify the brotherhood of themselves within each other. So this conflict, like we know, stems from what the Russian president sees as the encroachment of the eastern region of Europe by NATO. The Russian President Putin was livid that the United States and East NATO, the NATO and the allies have expanded, thereby breaching the agreement on the non-expansionist theory of NATO towards Eastern region, that is, those who include the former Soviet blocs. But like I normally argue, the problem is not that these former Soviet countries wanted to join NATO. That's not the issue. The problem is that Putin well, Russia, precisely, let me use Russia as a country, have not really treated these their brothers so nice in a way that they should long more to belong to them than to belong elsewhere. Let's look at countries like Mexico, Canada, and other countries that surround US. Most of their citizens still crave to come over to America, no matter how tough the immigration law is, no matter how tough the American political situation may be, they still see it as a land of freedom. Russia, precisely Putin, has failed to project Russia um, as a place where members of the former Soviet bloc can crave to come and express their full freedom, their full humanity, and their full love. So when some of these people try to leave and identify with members of the free world, it causes anger on the part of Putin. So his invasion and claim of genocide and others are just mere basis to invade a sovereign nation so as to send a warning to NATO that he's ready to do more. But what's not like is that in Ukraine, there is that patriotic spirit that has been forged from this immoral invasion, if I have to use that word, which have targeted their cities and ensure that any government that comes to rule over them will not be accepted from outside. Yeah, this, well, as you can see now, it is even clearer to Russia that, especially Putin, who thought that, okay, with few days or more, that, these people are going to bend to my way, that maybe the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, will just bow down to um, his immoral act of trying to subvert him. I know Putin main target as it stands is to actually install a puppet regime in Kiev that will bow down to the dictates of Russia and follow up with whatever he wants, just like the former president did in 2014, which led to his annexation of Crimea. So, but there are a couple of Putin's mistakes. How do you explain to a Russian who at this invasion that I should go ahead and kill my brothers if Putin, though he has given the order for the military men of Ukraine to kill, or rather to ensure that his orders are carried out in Ukraine. But these people recognize themselves in each other. For a military man to go ahead and kill his brother because the president says so is somehow absurd. And in the attempt of some of his troops to crush the Ukrainian brothers, it has led to this global outcry. And one of the mistakes he made was that he actually underestimated the West. Just like Biden said, he has done more in unifying NATO than even dividing them. With the way they rallied around and proposed series of sanctions to deal with his immoral invasion, has shown that the West has come together to ensure that the era of authoritarianism is dead and buried. Of course, like I see the support that we see from some Londoners who stand up to the Ukrainian anthem. And of course, the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Germany, where the blue and gold of Ukrainian flag were flew. So I think this is not just a battle of the West versus Putin. I wouldn't like to categorize Russia as people that are on the wrong side of history, because I know from the news we've heard that some Russians are actually disenchanted with what Putin is doing. In fact, the owner of the club, Chelsea, Roman Abramovich, decided to sell his club and offer the gains of the proceeds to the Ukrainians just to protest Putin's immoral invasion. So all this All this that happens actually because of the way one man has decided to project his ego as a national anthem. So this is not only morally wrong, but it has, like you said, raised the prospect of a catastrophic escalation. Okay, just imagine Putin insisted, or rather told his military officials to raise their nuclear alert level. In response to a sanction, we are raising the nuclear alert level. So he, the possibility of issuing a nuclear threat, is completely unacceptable. Though the condemnation of um, um, Russia has failed in the UN Security Council, the General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to condemn that invasion and ask Russia to withdraw. Even though few countries like Belarus and the allies, Syria and co, have voted against, and 5 countries, including China, abstained from voting. But the world has sent a clear message that 141 out of 193 countries are not as do not accept another country meddling with the sovereignty of another country, invading another country immorally, like Putin have done. Some will go ahead to criticize, oh, America have done the same thing in Iraq. Well, when Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, we all were in one voice and accord to condemn that invasion. That in the eyes of the UN Charter, that such invasion is morally wrong. So that someone has done wrong in the past is not a basis to continue to do wrong in the future. It is a fallacy that would be hold in the light of scrutiny when it is really interrogated. So, but let us look at the option. How do we move forward from this conflict? Like you said, for me, the first point of departure should be, let's begin with a ceasefire agreement between both parties. Let's begin with a ceasefire agreement so that both Russia and Ukraine should stop with the fight going ahead so far. Ceasefire agreement. With the ceasefire agreement, you can now marshal out steps and protocols of both the withdrawal of Putin forces and the way to restore democracy fully again in Ukraine. I know some of the demands of Putin are actually overboard, which led NATO to decline most of his demands. But if we can begin with this basic template of ceasefire, then the diplomacy can take long to marshal out how to proceed. But let's de-escalate first the fight. As we see from the information out there, we have a refugee crisis already. More than 1 million people have fled their homes and into neighboring Poland. What happens if possibly Putin forces keep chasing these refugees up to the shores of Poland and have any contact with the Polish authorities? That is, and maybe with NATO principle of an injury to one is an injury to all. NATO before to intervene. So far, the most EU have done is to provide aid or weapons to the Ukrainian authorities. But if anything prevention happens, where Putin forces should encroach into the Polish territory, the way we see the world now may not likely be the way it is. So, although I know he knows that anyway, but bullies, especially a part of Putin, like him, dictators sometimes do not have that limit. So it is important that those who can, let's say, those who Putin listens to, who can talk to Putin, should actually tell him, let's begin with that basic template I proposed earlier, ceasefire agreement. With that ceasefire agreement, then we can proceed to the next agenda on the list. So I know in terms of the sanction, which it has been working effectively. Um, the Russian ruble has collapsed by more than 80%. Their banks are suffering, their billionaires, yards, some of them have been seized, and the sanctions are actually working. The economic sanctions are actually working. Yet, the people of Ukraine are dying. In other words, humanity is bleeding because of this. No matter the humanitarian aid and all that, it hasn't served well to cushion the effect from the Ukrainian people. So more needs to be done. Actually, more needs to be done. And with the way things are going currently, if Putin should succeed, if Putin should succeed, then it is actually quite disastrous because he's going to seize Ukraine and then will now give legitimacy to dictators that they can invade any country they want without any consequences. So by all means, that should be used, with the exception of nuclear threat. This Russian immoral invasion should and can be stopped.
Thank you, Ugochukwu. Now, I will say this and cut this from the recording. We seem to have lost Ugochukwu's camera image, but hopefully he can get it back. We can continue the conversation, though. So, Ugochukwu, I really appreciate your analysis and the perspective you provide, which is valuable in part because you have the ability to take more of a detached observer's perspective than many of us in the Western countries, given that Nigeria is not a member of NATO. And so at least if there were an initial escalation of tensions between NATO and Russia, Nigeria would not be involved. Of course, the consequences of a world war would be damaging for everybody. And we need to bring in perspectives from throughout the world in order to essentially communicate the importance of averting a world war that is ultimately going to affect people in countries that are not a direct party to this conflict. So we are going to return to a lot of the insights that Ugochukwu shared later on. But now I would like to ask Pam Keefe to provide her thoughts on the current crisis and what can be done to de-escalate. Yes, Pam, I think you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
Please proceed.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends in Russia and around the world, and I think what we're losing sight of, and what the world is losing sight of, is that the real fight is against aging and death, and that it doesn't really matter who runs what country if we're all going to die anyway of disease and aging. So, rather than fighting over, petty things like whether Ukraine is part of Russia, the governments are missing sight of the real battle and the real things that we should be focusing on as humanity, and the waste in money in what we're spending on arms and weapons and all of these things to support one country or the other could be spent on good causes to feed people and make the world more sustainable and help save lives and put into science. So I think it's important that we look for a way to reset what these governments are focused on to what really matters in the world.
Yes, absolutely. We have seen a misallocation of resources, to be sure, away from science and technology and catalyzing research progress and improving human life toward the means of destruction, warfare, geopolitical aggression. Certainly, Putin's government has engaged in geopolitical aggression, but Western governments are not immune from blame in this situation either, because they have created a situation where any local conflict that Putin might spark, because of his expansionistic tendencies, has the risk of escalating into a global conflict, which will then engulf many of the countries of the world, the countries with the most advanced weaponry, and destroy the precious infrastructure that we need for accomplishing scientific and technological breakthroughs. So it's quite a tragic situation. And I agree with you, Pam. I think it's imperative to try to persuade as many politicians as possible to step away from this brink and focus on improving the human condition, including through longevity research and creating the kind of society where people will care more about extending lives than about shortening them. So I wonder, Pam, in this current situation, what do you think could be done to de-escalate, especially now that Putin has made threats of a nuclear strike, in essence, by instructing his central command to place the nuclear weapons of Russia on high alert as a so-called strategic deterrent. But we don't know when and under what circumstances he would actually order a nuclear strike. But nonetheless, how do we greatly lower the probability of that, to say the least?
I think that's a really good point, Gennady. And it's about negotiation at this point in time and compromise. We need to de-escalate the situation, and Putin needs to have a way out. He needs to have some kind of a compromise so that he can gracefully bow out with his ego and dignity, because we are dealing with that, and we have to be aware of the real circumstances, that he does have an ego and he does have an agenda. So he needs to feel like he has a win. Ukraine needs to feel like they have a win. And this is going to take some very savvy negotiation among both parties to de-escalate the situation and have both parties walk away, feel like they've walked away with something that they can live with, and also walk away with a little bit of compromise on both sides.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you that there needs to be a solution that allows each side to claim some significant victory and save face in spite of all of the damage that has been done and all of the losses that have been inflicted that unfortunately are not capable of being reversed entirely. One cannot resurrect someone from the dead at this point in time, and the people who were killed, unfortunately, are lost forever. Nonetheless, there needs to be enough cool, calm, collected judgment on both sides to be able to recognize that the additional cost that would be imposed by the continuation of this conflict is so much greater that each side should be willing to give some concessions in exchange for a few of its objectives being met. And this is where I wanted to follow up with Ugochukwu, because Ugochukwu talked about the importance of a negotiated ceasefire. And right now we're in a situation where a major Russian troop convoy is advancing on Kiev very slowly because it has terrible supply chain issues. Nonetheless, the Russian military still considers itself to have an overwhelming advantage, even though it hasn't been using that advantage very well or very effectively in combat. And on the other hand, the Ukrainian side believes that it can still hold out and defend its territory and inflict heavy casualties on the Russian advance. So each side right now is unfortunately emboldened to continue the fighting. In terms of the negotiations that are ongoing, it seems that some of them, at the very least, are intended for show, intended by each side to tell its constituents that it's trying to do something to achieve a ceasefire, but neither side has really seriously conceded anything to the other side or indicated a willingness to concede anything to the other side. And that, to me, is highly troubling. So if you were in the position of being a mediator or somebody who could influence either side, what would you suggest that each side concede in order for a ceasefire to be reached?
Wow, that is a very crucial, in fact, essential question, I say, because there are a couple of demands that needs to be met. If I'm to be really fair to both Russia and Ukraine. The first of its kind is, I would suggest NATO to close its open door policy. That is not allowing Ukraine to join NATO if they wish. But I will suggest that Ukraine concede to Russia in a well-signed agreement that they will not join NATO. Then I would like for Putin to immediately withdraw, to concede, to immediately withdraw all his forces that are in Ukraine currently. And then to respect, because even the Ukrainian president was saying that most of the agreements they have with Russia, the Minsk agreements which they have with Russia about 2 years ago or so, have been violated repeatedly by Russia. So if Russia can guarantee, based on integrity, that they won't meddle unnecessarily into the affairs of Ukraine, that Ukraine will be treated as a sovereign nation that it is, instead of Ukraine being seen, as Putin has said, being seen as an extension of Russia. Yes, it may have been an extension of Russia, but we are facing a totally new geopolitical reality, that Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and you can't say you have veto over the affairs in Kyiv. No. So why the facts can be accepted that Russia will not be happy to see NATO build its military alliance compartment in Ukraine, because, as the saying goes, it undermines the national security. But at the same time, they shouldn't treat their neighbors as inferiors or treat them in a high-handed manner. Maybe Putin extending his authoritarian tendency to Ukraine. No. So the major concession now, like I said, is on both sides. If there is an agreement that can be effectively worked out upon, then that is it. Like you said, we really need to, both sides need to save face, because if you should allow Putin's ego to continue to run this show, then this war can linger far more than we've seen it currently. And the Russian people, as much as the Ukrainian people, still suffer the consequences with these numerous sanctions and all that from NATO and its allies, EU, then it impoverishes the Russian people, even though the Ukrainian people are being displaced. So the best point is then the concession to be made. Why Ukraine, in a let's say, agreed upon arrangement that is actually effective, that can be effected per se, then Ukraine can guarantee of not joining NATO, while Russia should withdraw unconditionally and sign never to meddle into the affairs of its sovereign neighbors.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ugochukwu. And the key points of your proposal would be essentially a guarantee on the part of Ukraine and NATO that Ukraine will not be admitted as a member of NATO in exchange for a complete withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine and a guarantee of Ukraine's sovereignty and Russia's non-interference in the affairs of Ukraine. I would say that is a fair deal and a bargain for the Western powers, because really NATO should not want Ukraine to be a member of NATO because of the Article 5 collective defense provisions. This is historically a very volatile part of the world where territory has changed hands essentially ever since humans settled in Eastern Europe. And there's a reason why that is the case. There are not many, let's say, natural barriers, natural geographical barriers. The land is very rich in resources, and there are a lot of claimants. And historically, there have been a lot of claimants to that land. So the boundaries of what today is Ukraine have throughout history been parts of various great powers, if one could call them that. The Kievan Rus, of course, was a realm of multiple principalities. Then it got taken over by the Mongol horde. At the same time, from the west, Poland, Lithuania took over large segments of what is today Ukraine. The Ottoman Empire took over large segments of what is today Ukraine. Sweden invaded what is today Ukraine in the early 18th century and fought a major battle with Peter the Great of Russia at Poltava.
I thought he was from Finland.
No, that was Charles XII of Sweden, who invaded these territories. And some Ukrainians fought on the Swedish side, some Ukrainians fought on the Russian side. It was historically a period of continually shifting territorial possessions and alliances. But the main issue here is, how do we prevent a conflict in that part of the world from engulfing the rest of the world? Because historically there have been conflicts in that part of the world, and unfortunately it seems there will continue to be conflicts in that part of the world. But NATO's collective defense obligations are extremely consequential, because Article 5 essentially states if there's any invasion of the territory of a NATO member country, then all of the NATO member countries.
World War I. That's
right.
Not good.
Right. Well, in World War I, of course, NATO didn't exist, but there was a network of alliances among the European powers that led a troubling but relatively local incident in Serbia, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, to trigger all of these reciprocal obligations. And every great power in Europe entered into war against the other side in that network of alliances. But even then, the situation was less troubling than it is today, because World War I encompassed most of the globe, but it was fought using conventional weapons, and it wiped out, I believe, somewhere between 1% and 2% of the world population at that time. It could never have wiped out the entirety of humanity. And this is important to note, that right now the stakes are so much higher because the great powers, particularly the United States and Russia, have the ability to wipe out the rest of human civilization and human life. So this is extremely important, and I would say for the West, accepting Ugochukwu's set of proposals would be a great bargain, because it wouldn't substantively affect anything of value that the Western countries already possess. It wouldn't compromise any of the existing NATO members. It would just commit not to expand NATO to territory that NATO shouldn't want to have its collective defense obligations triggered over. On the other hand, this, I think, is the only way out for Putin that could potentially lead him to be able to claim some sort of victory. Because if we know anything about Putin and his personality, it is that he does not like to back down. He does not like to admit defeat. And if he feels like he is being pressured, if he feels like he is being backed into a corner, he is going to lash out. He is going to double down. He is going to become more aggressive. And this is a sign of great insecurity on his part, of course. He feels that his hold on power is slipping, but that is the moment when he is most dangerous and when he could act quite recklessly. So he ought to be pleased. If he has a thread of rationality remaining in him, he ought to be pleased if he's offered a way to claim a symbolic victory, like the promise that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO, and he could withdraw his troops and actually prevent colossal loss of life among Russian soldiers, because that colossal loss of life is going to reflect very adversely on his popularity at home. He is already encountering some significant protests, even though he has cracked down heavily on dissent. And as a result of this, he may have a hard time maintaining his grip on authoritarian power at home. But he can soften the blow if he stems the loss of life, if he prevents more of his soldiers from dying. So even withdrawing from Ukraine could be at least presented as a kind of victory or softening of the consequences of this misadventure on his part. And I will add one additional thought. Putin surprised me when he invaded Ukraine, because I did not think that it would have been in his rational interests at all to do so. I think he made a major miscalculation when he invaded Ukraine, and I thought that he would have taken that into account, because the West did impose extremely severe sanctions, both personally against Putin and his inner circle, as well as against the Russian economy. And he should have anticipated that this would be coming. Moreover, in the 21st century, this kind of massive loss of civilian life, this kind of destruction of cities and infrastructure is seen as appalling. And people get live footage of it from various vantage points on social media. So it's impossible to control the narrative of a war through propaganda anymore. And people are rightly outraged at all of the devastation that has been happening. So it is really strange to me that Putin didn't factor all of that, but suffice it to say, he's not as rational as many people thought. But nonetheless, he may just be rational enough to be willing to cut his losses if he's convinced that he can package it as a victory for propaganda purposes. at home. So that's my thinking on it. I wanted to get Sharif's thinking on the situation, since his is another perspective from a different part of the world that I think would be valuable here.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for giving me the opportunity. I just want to share because I'm from Bangladesh. My father was a freedom fighter in 1971. Not only my father's, many of my family members actually involved with this war with India and Pakistan. Yes, in Bangladesh get freedoms. That is the way that now we are working and we are surviving. From my personal life, I get a lot of my learning, especially about politics, about war, and these things from my father, from my uncles, because all of them actually were freedom fighters. So I can understand the pain of the Ukrainian peoples that when people they have to lift their country, because I hear that Bangladeshi people they have to lift their country, they have to go to the India, they take the shelters, a lot of history. Millions of people actually died in 1971 in Bangladesh. So that's why for my family issues, I can understand what is the pain of Ukraine. But, and that's why actually I do more focus on talent economy, more focus on peoples, because most of the cases around the world, everybody, they just discuss and work for investment as well as for technology, but nobody caring about people. So that's why I'm taking this initiative of talent economy, because we have to be more careful about people. But not only this ego or this kind of things is actually playing for this wire. I believe there is more economical issues, and we have to understand and we have to clearly think that what is happening. If you see this 2021, according to some research report, you can find that arms sales of top 100 arms companies continue to grow, even in the pandemic situation, and they make business around $531 billion. It's according to the SPIRM. And this research paper actually published this information published in 6 December 2021. This is one of the indicators what is happening in the industries. I believe the political party like Transhumanist, now you have to prove your leadership. Now you have to prove your strength, and we have to integrate with your peoples and politics. Why? If you see this arms business and everything behind the scene, actually what is happening, it's not only ego, it's not only economic, many things happening. When the arms productions and arms business rapidly growing, that time there is a chance more war, more unrest will happen. And who actually, you have to understand the beneficiary of this war. That is the fact. Who is actually getting the benefits? These are the organizations and the corporations are benefited, because those who extremely engage with these arms productions, we are observing that more than $2,000 billion actually the developed world and everyone actually expending for these militaries and these issues. So when we are observing in 2020 this arms business is growing, definitely there is a chance any part of the world we will see unrest, we will observe this kind of things. This is number one. So we have to be very much careful who is actually beneficiary. So you peoples, like example American peoples, people from all of the G20, from European Union, from Russia, they have to understand that you should not invest more of your taxpayers' money for arms business from this kind of research, for this kind of things. If you can invest more in human developments, you can invest more in developing world, you can more invest in healthcare system, you can more invest in other scientific research. But that is, I believe, the major problem we are happening right now. And second things, when this war happens, oil price increasing, who is getting the benefit actually from this war? Maybe Russia is getting benefits, Saudi Arabia may be getting benefit, USA getting benefits for this oil price increase. So always when this kind of things happen, I learned from my fathers, politicians can play a major roles. That's why I believe transhumanist parties, they have to play a very strong role right now. They have to engage with more people from USA, from other part of the world. This is the beginning, I believe. This is the beginnings, because the more and more negative things will happen. I believe this war will not stop soon, because when actually these things started, it takes long times. Example, in Bangladesh, where I hear from my father, it takes 9 months, but maybe we do not know, it takes more time. So everywhere around the world, it's in Africa, it's in Middle East, if it's in Europe, any kind of war, I believe that we have to protect it. First thing first, we have to understand that we should not invest a lot of money for war. We should not invest money for arms productions. We should not invest more money for military expenditures. This is the way actually things happening. And who actually major exporter of these arms and everything? I'm sorry, it's USA, it's Russia, it's all of the G20 major countries they are. Who is actually a major importer of these arms? It's India, it's Middle East, Saudi Arabia. These are the countries. So we have to be truthful. We have to be focused with these things. It's not only the ego. It's not only with contract, you cannot do anything. With agreement, you cannot do everything. We have to change our political system. That's why I joined in Transhumanist Party, because you have that kind of credibility. You are bringing modern science, technology in the forefront. But what is the other political organization they are doing? They are investing their money and everything for that. How many people actually getting vaccine? In that situations, they go for a war because of this, all of the business in arms and everything. So I believe the developed world, developing worlds, all of the civil people, educated people, thinkers, think tanks, everybody has to work together. We have to protect human lives. We have to give the priority, the human developments. Only with this war, with this imperialism, it will not work. And reality is that those who do this kind of things, it's definitely miscalculations. I do not know how history will think about Mr. Putin, how the history, those who go to the war, they actually not successful. Reality is that USA go to the war in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, they are not successful. So your money, your hard-earned money, your tax money is grow in the wrong way. So what we have to do, first we have to fix the politics. We have to bring the right politician in the right place. We have to, and another thing, this is the problem I believe. I also get chance to visit many universities, many developed nations. We have to develop the empathy, wisdoms. I think there is a major problem with the leadership developments. Major problems. Because, example, if you see the characteristics of the Putin, where he from? He is a KGB agent. So you cannot expect much empathy and the much good leadership approach from Putin. So that is the thing. How you develop your people, this is important. I always said when I was in Oxford University, Cambridge University, hey, I come to Oxford University for learning. So now your time, you visit country like Bangladesh, India, China, Africa. Many of my friends, they visit. Now they are working for Singapore's and many governments. And yes, it gives them sympathy. So when ego comes, like when you grow yourself, so that times if you do not engage with different cultures, different peoples, different things, you cannot understand the pain of the people that time. So even though I request the Russian people, you should go for proper democratic approach. You cannot make, like example, yes, USA model is good, at least maximum 2 times their president can be president, then they bring the new president. Proper democratic approach also important. When you run a country through an undemocratic way, when you run a country with with lack of policy and development, these things happen. So I believe major problem in politics. I strongly believe that Transhumanist Party can solve this problem. But again, we have to attract young people. We have to attract educated group of people. We need leadership with more empathy. 2 knowledge, I believe, we need is very important. Number 1, the knowledge we get from Ivy Leagues, from University of Malayas and all of the big university. I believe Western, they are very good for this kind of modern science, engineering, and technology. Another things I want to say, you need to get some sort of empathy, some sort of spiritual knowledge, and what you can learn it from Asia, from Africa. You can see that Steve Jobs, he come to India and learned that meditations and everything. So there, I request all of the education institutions, all of the NGOs, all of the organizations, exchange your youth. Europe should come here, I should go to Europe. America should come here, I should go to USA. This is the way we can develop better leaderships. So three things. Number one, we have to solve this arms business. I believe that you people can solve these things. You have to negotiate with your government that we should not invest our money for this kind of arms business, this kind of research and everything. Number two, we need a proper policy and political organization. I request all of the young, talented people, please join in the good platform. Let's say Transhumanist Party, good platform. Then they can understand how they can grow themselves. They are very much, I want to say, scattered. So in that situation, next 10 and 20 years, we will face a lot of challenges. And I'm sure there is a lackings of good leadership. And number three, as much as possible, we have to closely work together from developed nations and developing nations. And finally, better policy, and better policy. And from the beginning, you have to understand that we should not invest more money for war, more money for these arms things. So thank you for all of your support. And another things like World Talent Economy Forum, why I developed these things, because I want to put human first. I want to put people first. Already, I can ensure that from Malaysia, Singapore, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Middle East, many people, many activists, many NGO, many universities, more than millions of people, they are engaging with us, and they believe this will be the right approach. And Transhumanist Party always, they will be the front line, because I know that you have some excellent resources. If we can exchange your resource, we can develop ourselves. So that is my view.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sharif, for your insights. And there is a lot of value here in analyzing the situation and determining what can be done to ameliorate it. First of all, I agree it's extremely important to look beneath the surface and consider some of the, let's say, pecuniary or financial motivations of certain actors involved, and ask the famous question from Marcus Tullius Cicero, cui bono, who benefits from this? And the unfortunate fact is, when there's a military conflict like this, the demand for weaponry spikes, and the large armaments manufacturers do benefit. Dwight Eisenhower, one of the last presidents in the US who actually was sufficiently independent of the military-industrial complex, identified and critiqued the military-industrial complex back in 1961, 1 year before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he pointed out how dangerous it was for the United States to be so heavily reliant on this network of powerful corporations who, of course, could hire a lot of lobbyists and propagandists to advocate for war that would then, of course, fuel their business. So since that time, unfortunately, Eisenhower's words have fallen on deaf ears. And it is astonishing to me how quickly a lot of people in the United States and other European countries have been calling for an escalation of tensions. People who couldn't identify Ukraine on the world map just a few weeks ago are calling now for a no-fly zone to be established, or for weapons to be sent to Ukraine, or for NATO boots on the ground, even though they might have had absolutely no connection with that region. And there's a great thread by Rutger Bregman, who is a historian who is just astonished at the speed with which people all of a sudden became radical proponents of escalation in this conflict without knowing very much about this conflict. So I do believe that it's imperative to take a few steps back here and analyze, how did all of this propaganda come about? Who benefits? Who would actually thrive if this war became protracted and more devastating? Certainly everybody who is advocating for weapons to be sent to Ukraine has to take a step back and consider, well, what will this do to the war in Ukraine? Will it shorten it? Most certainly not. If you give weapons to one side of the conflict, that side is going to have a greater capability of fighting, and then that will prolong the conflict. If that prolongs the conflict, who benefits? Those who can continue manufacturing and sending weapons. So that is an aspect of the conversation that needs to be emphasized so that the civilian populations everywhere in the world recognize this is not a war for them. This is not a war that will benefit them. This is a war that will benefit a few highly concentrated special interests, and everyone else, unfortunately, is going to suffer. Now, let us hear from Art Ramon Garcia with regard to his thoughts and any questions that he may have for the other panelists.
What I think is going to calm down Putin is he's going to want that agreement from the Ukraine, not to join NATO. But I think he's going to take all this territory where the pro-Russians are at, and it's like a third of the country. So I think he's going to annex all these other states where the pro-Russians are at, and that's the only thing that's going to appease him. Otherwise, it's going to turn into a protracted proxy war. I don't see it. I don't see him backing down. I don't know where else it's going to go. No, I don't have any questions.
Yeah, narcissists don't back down. I totally agree with Pam that Putin needs a way out because he's a narcissist, and if he don't have a way out, he will burn the house down on the way out. That's what they do. It was no surprise what happened January 6th. I mean, it's par for the course. That's standard operating procedure for a narcissist. They will try to, but like Sharif said, he's right too. It's more complicated than just that. I mean, yeah, their ego is a big deal, but you're right. It's a lot more complicated than that. And that whole, I agree also with the weapons sales and all of that. I mean, there's, that goes way back to, who knows how long, but at least World War I know, where there'd be, companies that are selling to both sides, or banks that are loaning money to both sides. They don't care who wins. They win either way. In fact, they want the war. The more war, the more bullets they sell, the more loans they can give out. There's an incentive for certain powerful people for war. And yeah, we need to do something about that. And I totally agree about empathy and leadership. That was a good point, Sharif. Because if I could do one thing in this world before I go, if I had to go, it would be keep people with no empathy out of positions of power. Would you want a psychopath to watch your children? Would you want a psychopath to watch your 90-year-old mother? No. So why do we want him as president? No, there should be mandatory testing, and that should be publicly posted. And, I mean, I'm not saying that we should just ban them, but it should be known, hey, everybody, this guy's nuts. Clinically, he's a narcissist, he's a psychopath. If you want to still vote for him, you can, but you've been warned, at least. Now, that over in Russia, that's probably a different story. How do you, there would have been no keeping, Putin out. You couldn't just make a law there like they possibly could here. But so, a lot of this, I don't know how we could actually do it. Like with the arms sales on both sides, I don't know how we would even fix that. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. Go ahead, Sharif.
Yes, one thing I want to say why I joined Transhumanist Party. We need to develop a good political party. The solution is that we need to bring all of the talented people in politics. When actually this kind of major crisis, corruptions, all of the problem happening, when actually in politics we do not have enough talented people in our politics. We need to bring more talented people, more educated people, not only the businessman, more scientists, more thinkers we have to bring in the politics. Then you can find that when politics will play properly, and when we can solve this political complex problem, we bring right kind of leaders with empathy, with proper understanding of different cultures, different peoples, then I believe that we get better results. So that's why I request to the Honorable Chairman, we have to engage with millions of people. And our strategy, politics has major problem because political party, they are dependent on all of the large corporations and this kind of black monies. So we have to develop a strategy. My father always says, I'm not for millionaires, I am for millions. So we have to develop our strategy for million people. They will support us, we will support them, and then we can stop this kind of unrest and this kind of problem.
That's interesting that you say that. I'm wondering if you'd have any suggestions. I know I'm kind of been talking with Mike DeVerde about getting some kind of document together or some sort of like a coalition agreement, because on the Discord server in the Illinois channel, we had the pirate party from Illinois come in there and want to ally with us. That's cool. They have one plank on their platform and it's okay. So, but what does that look like? What does it look like in black and white? What's the rules of this? You know what I mean? So we got to get it in. We have to get some document in writing of what we want out of it, what we're willing to give them out of it, what we all want to accomplish. Mike wants to ally with the Forward Party, and I think that's a pretty good idea. Andrew Yang, I think he's kind of like Transhumanist with just the Forward name on it. And it's, Forward probably sounds better than Transhumanist, but still, maybe we can get Andrew Yang to, when he says forward, maybe he'll say forward, and the Transhumanist Party says and upward also. If we can get him to say that, I think that'd be a win.
Well, we have the category of allied organizations, and some of them are identified on our website, though that list ought to be updated. We can approach them on a case-by-case basis and see where our interests align and see where we can cooperate and hopefully reach a common understanding. In some cases, it might not even involve signing a document as long as our goals are quite similar enough, or in certain cases even identical, and we can rely on each of our respective organizations to pursue those goals in good faith. But on the subject of the conflict in Ukraine, it's interesting that you discussed, Jason, the personality traits of a narcissist and how dangerous those can be for someone in power. It reminded me of the analysis by Friedrich Hayek, the great Austrian economist and political thinker, with regard to. It reminded me of the analysis of Friedrich Hayek, the great Austrian economist and political thinker, with regard to the incentives in certain political orders where the worst rise to the top. Essentially, if you don't have a system with sufficient checks and balances, if you have a system which rewards the most ruthless people, then you are going to get the narcissists, you are going to get the sociopaths.
That's exactly what's been happening in the Republican Party.
That's exactly what has been happening in the political systems of a lot of countries. If you observe the political competition in the United States, it's not quite as brutal as in Russia because people don't imprison their political opponents generally, but it is becoming a lot less civilized than it had been in, say, the 1970s. In the 1970s, yes, politicians could be unkind to one another, but they stayed within far more constrained bounds of civility than they do today. Nonetheless, the US political system still has enough checks and balances and enough incentives for people to behave peacefully that you don't see the most terrible psychopaths and sociopaths rising to the top at this time. And I would say, even with certain politicians that we've observed recently, based on just looking at world history and some of the politicians who have come about in other times and places, the ones we see in the United States are still relatively mild. The problem is one of the trajectory in which it is headed. And I would say this is a problem both on the right and on the left. But in the Russian political system, there are no checks and balances, essentially. So it is a situation where the most ruthless person, essentially, was able to rise to the top and stay in power for 22 years. However, the major problem right now is previously we thought this person's ruthlessness was more targeted, and he would, for instance, take out his prominent political opponents, the people who could really expose corruption or wrongdoing, but that he wouldn't just blindly lash out. Unfortunately, with this invasion of Ukraine, we were quite surprised at what he's capable of doing. And this may well be because something affected his judgment during the pandemic. It is said that he was quite isolated by his own will, and he didn't admit a lot of people to give him advice that might have provided a reality check. And as a result, he might have greatly miscalculated the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine because of wishful thinking. And so one task that I think would be important is how to bring him back to reality, how to get him to see a realistic picture of what the consequences of his actions would be like, not through belligerence, but through understanding, oh, you're going to be isolated from the world. Your people are going to suffer. You're going to have more unrest in your country, not less, as a result of this. And get him to change course to try to mitigate some of those consequences rather than lashing out further. And this is where anyone's insight really would be appreciated. How would you deal with such an individual if you had the opportunity to communicate this to him? What do you think would work? What do you think would not work? Let's get some thoughts from Ugochukwu on this question.
Okay, thank you so much. Once again, Junadi. I want to look at the question Jason asked. He asked me if, in addition to allowing Russia to the grant to receive the guarantee from Ukraine that they won't join NATO, will they allow them to take over the Donbass region? The answer to that question is capital no. Yeah, I appreciate some of the points made by Shari. You know, the world is far better without those nuclear stockpiles that many countries like US and Russia, France, UK have gathered over the years in anticipation of a nuclear threat. The reason why most of us are actually afraid is because we already know that in the eventuality of escalation to a nuclear conflict, that no one, no, when I mean no one is safe at all. But we live in a world where, as Martin Luther King will say, we have misguided men and guided missiles. We live in such a world where someone like Putin, who is, in my own estimation, and what some psychologists have said, is actually a deranged egomaniac, who, like Jason rightly pointed out, had it been he had gone through a psychological evaluation, I don't think he would match the true requirements of being a leader. Not to talk of presiding over 145 million people and a 1.6 trillion economy like Russia, which we know is a country, heavily blessed by providence, I'm going to use that word, in terms of natural gas and oil and even human resources, talent. But what did we achieve with this? Basically nothing. Instead of putting these huge resources to good use, it's being perverted by a leader who decide to matriculate these resources in the garb of personal aim, of vindictiveness towards the West. Yeah, like I said before, the West may not be thoroughly innocent in the way they run their affairs. But the fact is that over the years, democracy has proven to be far better than authoritarianism. Democracy has given people the freedom to show themselves, to express that freedom which is innate in man. And if this conflict is to be de-escalated, though as much as we want to massage Putin's ego, there are certain things that cannot be considered. And that's why we need to maintain that the conditions Russia normally bring to the table are non-starters. How can you annex? Okay, you annexed, Crimea in 2014, and to an extent there was no much consequences. Maybe such has embodied you to go ahead to meddle and annex further regions of people. No matter how much we have grown in terms of the world, nothing gives someone the right to meddle and inflict pain on another human being. And that's part of what the transhumanist kind of, teaches, that denuclearization, demilitarization, so that we can put the talents of human to the best of its use, which is in pursuance of those things that elevate rather than degrade humanity. We have, but unfortunately, we have people who are more interested in expanding power than in furthering development. And with such mere expansion of power, they are more interested in how much do I gain in terms of annexation of people's territory than how much do I better the lives of my own citizens at home. No, if Putin should ask himself this question, how do I grow the GDP of Russia to the point where we can, as Sharif said, give aid to other countries, not just military aid, because those military aid shouldn't be given. I know it may sound controversial. The work should be targeted towards how do we reduce the possibility of military conflict, not even giving military aid to people. Though the only place I would say that military people should be deployed against is against terrorists who have sworn an allegiance or an oath to obliterate humanity. If this war is against terrorists or against people who have decided to cause harm to men, women, and children, then this would have been a kind of noble cause in usage of military force. But as it stands now, to use it to fight against the freedom of others is anti-humanity. But it's even anti-transhumanity, to use that word. So no one should fight against the freedom of the people's will to be free. The freedom of man is not just a mere construct of the Western world. It's not just a mere, parchments on paper written. These are the internal edicts of the universe. It is an internal edict of the universe which people, pursue. How do I express myself? How do I unleash that talent within me? How do I become the best I can be? I believe these questions occur in the minds of Russians citizens as well as Ukrainian citizens. And when these two countries engage in this conflict, like you said, Gennady, those lost are lost forever. So, but the question is, how can we achieve this ceasefire so that no further lives will be lost, and that people can be given the freedom to really showcase their talent for the betterment of the world, for the improvement of humanity? The former who spoke talked about how do we work towards countering aging, towards reducing the prospect of human dying early. How do we invent medicine that will cure aging? Like people believe that aging is a disease. How do we improve the capacity of man to achieve transhuman feats? This should be the question that should occupy the minds of leaders, and not the problem of how do we manufacture, increase our nuclear, close the nuclear at a high alert level in case war reaches to that. There's nothing to be gained from the nuclear conflict, not even to Putin himself. If the world is peradventure obliterated, who is he going to govern? That is alive anyway. So I speak equally to the people of Ukraine. To the people of Ukraine, I am happy, particularly, that they stand up to defend their country. They stand up to defend, because the best way to deal with a bully It's not to cower in his face. It is to actually stand up against his, anti-human tendency. If you give an inch to a bully, he goes for a higher perimeter. So it is quite good that the people of Ukraine are there. My heart and my mind goes towards the families of victims who have lost their lives. And I sincerely plead that both parties should really get to a point of negotiation. At least, I keep repeating this point. If there is a way that they can have a ceasefire, the negotiation can linger for months, but let there be a ceasefire first. Negotiation can continue. It sounds probably naive, but that is the fact. If we must save lives of men, women, and children, we must not use our powerful economic resources to degrade humanity. Rather, it should be devoted, like Sherry said, to eliminate poverty from the earth. It should be devoted to improve healthcare system. It should be devoted to improve the education system. It should be devoted to improve infrastructure. It should be devoted to eliminate unemployment and others. We shouldn't misuse the resources of humanity the way it is currently being misused. So my proposal stands. Ceasefire is what is most immediate. Ceasefire agreement is the most immediate need currently. And from there we proceed, with little concession from both parties, like I mentioned earlier. But to leave the two regions, Luhansk and Donetsk to Russia is totally out of my own personal proposal.
Yes, thank you very much, Ugochukwu, for your insights here. And what you said is extremely important because you focused on the preservation of human life. And for us transhumanists, that is the highest value. So getting the ceasefire under whatever temporary circumstances that can be achieved is the most important priority, because then, as you correctly pointed out, the negotiations could proceed for months and each side could argue its various interests and figure out what concessions it is or isn't willing to make. But if in the meantime, people are not getting killed, cities are not getting destroyed, then de-escalation can happen in the background. So no situation is ever completely static. It's always evolving in some direction or another, or sometimes not evolving, but changing abruptly. So if people aren't being actively killed, if infrastructure isn't being actively destroyed, that's an opportunity for tempers to cool. That's an opportunity for certain repairs to be made, for some aspects of life in Ukraine to start returning to normal. And in the meantime, yes, the negotiations can proceed and some longer term settlement can be reached. And it's interesting, Crimea and the Donbass were mentioned in terms of Putin's annexation of Crimea and then his support for the separatists in the Donbass and recent recognition of the two small republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics in the Donbass region. So those two scenarios played out very differently because the annexation of Crimea was completely peaceful, and it was in fact supported by the majority of the population there. So if a fully transparent election were held, not just an election overseen by Putin's regime, which is clearly suspect because Putin's regime manipulates elections all the time. But if a fully transparent election with international observers were held, probably the people of Crimea, at least prior to this war in Ukraine, would have voted by quite a significant majority to join Russia. In the Donbass region, the chain of events was completely different because the separatists did engage in significant fighting with the Ukrainian military for many years. And it became what is called a frozen conflict, where essentially there was a lower level of fighting, but people still lost their lives, both military personnel on both sides and civilians. So that was a situation where some de-escalation would have been highly desirable, and a ceasefire prior to this recent invasion would have helped to de-escalate the situation over there. But it's interesting with Crimea, for 8 years, there was peace in that area, even though much of the world did not recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea, but de facto Russia had control over Crimea. And as long as firepower was not exchanged on the border between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine, there wasn't really that much of a problem, even though it would have probably taken many years or decades to get to the point where there could be some sort of international agreement about the status of Crimea. So even if we could get the situation to that point where de facto there is no fighting and there are certain de facto boundaries formed that neither side wishes to breach, but de jure, there isn't an agreement yet because neither side really wants to make the symbolic concessions. Well, that's not a great situation. It's not an ideal situation, but it's much better than a hot war, which is what we have right now. So we can proceed, I think, to pose a similar question to Pam. How would one essentially convince Putin to see the reality as it is, not his own constructs, his own wishful thinking, which seems to have dominated his decision-making when he chose to invade Ukraine, but how to get him to see the situation the way many observers throughout the world see it in terms of the consequences of aggression and the harm that the aggression will do to him, even if the West doesn't escalate militarily.
I think one of the questions on my mind is it's the who as much as it is the how. Who's negotiating with him? In the talks that they've been having, and we don't get a lot of information from the press about what's actually happening in those negotiation talks, but I don't know if Zelensky and his team are really skilled at negotiating with someone like him, and what what preparation they have for these kind of talks and to be able to de-escalate, and who's the right person or who's the right party to go in and do this negotiation is something that I think we need to think about, because I don't feel that the Ukrainians are really up to the task, and it's too personal for them. They have this deep desire to keep everything as it was in their country and make no change at all, and they're fighting Goliath. So who is the right party to come in and do this negotiation? And I don't know the answer to this. It's a question.
Yes, it is quite an important question, too. Now, of course, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has tried to be that party, but it doesn't seem that he has been altogether successful, because he directly came to speak with Putin and wanted to prevent the invasion, but Putin went ahead anyway. And now he's still in communications with Putin, trying to minimize the attacks on civilians. So there is that, at least. But anyone who has any ideas for somebody else who could be a good intermediary, if not a neutral party, then at least an objective party who could appeal to certain motives that Putin has, please let me know. Sharif, it sounds like you have an idea. Sharif, you need to unmute your microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, actually, Russian people can negotiate with Putin. They are one and only sources. they have to negotiate with their president, and because they have to play a major roles, because this war not in between Russian peoples and Ukraine peoples. It's Putin. I believe even I saw many social media videos. The army, those who captured by the Ukraine people, they are discussing with their mother. So these mothers, these people, these parents, they have to negotiate with Putin. And they are the one and only source who can stop Putin. Not this kind of big countries, EU, this and that. Because behind this business, war, there is a big business, big corporations, big things. Only Russian people can solve this problem.
And this is interesting, Sharif, because to a certain extent, the Russian people have tried to solve this problem by going out into the streets and protesting, or if they work for independent media outlets, they did broadcast the truth, even though there is heavy censorship right now. And a lot of these independent media outlets are unfortunately being shut down. So Putin's reaction right now, up to this time, has been to crack down harder. And how does one change that, in your view? How does one get from the point where people try to negotiate with Putin, and if they're powerful and independent like Macron, then Putin will listen to them. If they're not powerful, if they're his subjects, he will suppress them. In free countries, a leader will not suppress his citizens if they express a dissenting viewpoint. How do we at least get to the point where Putin doesn't crack down on those who oppose the war domestically?
Okay, this is very interesting. But if you see the history, the political people, those who go for this kind of war, everybody actually lose. I believe with this initiative, Putin actually develop a big threat for his political career. I think this is the end. Actually, Putin start right away. Maybe 1 and 2 days, 1 and 2 months. Maybe this will not happen, but maybe I'm sure in between few months or few years, Putin will lose all of his controls, economical abilities, and many things, only for his bad decisions. Because war and these things is very complex. Right away, we will not get result. But in the long term, I can say, and you can take this note and this saloon, Putin will lose only because of his bad decision.
So, Sharif, you believe that Putin's days in office are numbered and that he perhaps has a few months left?
Yeah, sure. This is all bad political decisions, undoubtedly. Very bad. You just compare who is the hero, the Ukraine president or Putin? Who is the hero? Not only social media, who win the heart, right? The Ukraine president. Very simple. Ukraine, these presidents and these people, they win forever. Nobody can. It's part of history already. How they fight against Russia, and I believe Putin already take. This is actually happened. We in the business we said introduction, increase, maturity, decline. I believe politically Putin go for his declining stage. He will lost his powers and everything soon.
Yes, and it's interesting you mentioned Zelensky. I listened to Zelensky's speech in Russian to the Russian people prior to the invasion, essentially a kind of last-ditch effort on his part to prevent the war. And he was discussing how the Ukrainian people have no hostility toward Russia. They want to live in peace, and how war is so terrible and devastating, and one can only really lose if one engages in a war. I thought that speech was quite eloquent, quite on point, and it should have convinced a reasonable person not to go to war. Of course, Zelensky did try to reach out to Putin directly and received no response, which is why he made that particular address. But I agree, Zelensky is winning in terms of public relations on all fronts. What worries me is that he may be taking insufficient care to preserve his own life. I actually think it would have been a good idea for him sometime in the past few days at the latest to have fled Ukraine and formed a government in exile, because there he could continue to create this kind of messaging in safety. Right now, he has to actually evade active attempts on his life, assassination attempts that have been foiled thus far. But it's very unfortunate.
True, but you got to hand it to him. I mean, he inspired his whole entire nation. I mean, that one quote, "I need ammunition, not a ride." That's awesome. I mean, you know, there's people coming from other countries into Ukraine to fight. You know, he's almost kind of inspired the world in a way. I mean, he really stepped up to the plate. I gotta hand it to him.
Yes, the question is, though, to what extent is that going to affect the outcome? And I think it could, but it would help to have a ceasefire, because then if you have a ceasefire, then the public relations battle can be waged a lot more effectively. Right now, the advantage, the numerical advantage, is still on the Russian side, and quite considerably so. Russia is a bigger country with a bigger army. I believe the combined troop counts are somewhere in the neighborhood of 900,000 on the Russian side and 200,000 on the Ukrainian side. Of course, the Russian side can't deploy all of its troops at once, and it has all of these supply chain issues. But eventually, the convoys are going to get to their destinations. And if Putin becomes frustrated enough at the failure of the initial assaults, he will send in wave after wave with increased firepower, less discriminate targeting of Ukrainian population centers, which would be quite tragic. So Zelensky's forces may be overwhelmed ultimately, but with a ceasefire, that ceases to be as much of a concern, because then it's a matter of rhetorical strength rather than strength of arms. And yes, Zelensky has the advantage in that sense. So that could be a compelling argument for the Ukrainian side to try to achieve a ceasefire. They're actually better off fighting the war for public opinion rather than the war on the ground. And I would like to see that argument made to a greater extent on social media, and perhaps advance to the Ukrainian side directly, so that they realize cessation of hostilities benefits them. And while, yes, they've been courageous, it does no good to someone who is courageous but dead to be that way. So there should be some better options considered. Now, Jason, you had an interesting comment in our internal chat. First of all, you said it could have been worse because Putin lost the information war, and that wasn't necessarily a guarantee at the onset. But you said also that the person who would more effectively convince Putin to understand the reality of the situation would be an expert at manipulating narcissists or a psychiatrist. Now, I'd be interested in hearing you elaborate upon this, because I don't think Putin would take very kindly to communicating with a psychiatrist if he knew that this person was a psychiatrist. So how do you...
Yeah, I agree. He would have to be manipulated. I'm sure you couldn't let him know that it's a narcissist, a psychiatrist coming to visit him, but other narcissists are sometimes good at manipulating other narcissists. Putin played Trump like a fiddle. I mean, buttered him up, and I'll save all the other colorful adjectives, but yeah, and the strange thing is narcissists pretty, I could see should be pretty easy to set against each other. But yet, for some reason, they tend to stick together. That's kind of odd because they want to be the top dog. That's their mentality. But yet they like other people that are the same way. I think, this is just my opinion, but I think it's because they want to live in a world where might makes right. And they can just take what they want. And, if they're big and bad enough to do it, they can do it. And this other person, even though he's my enemy, he believes the same way. And so, in that sense, the other narcissists help to create this world where being a narcissist is okay. It's super tough, man, to try to deal with, a narcissist because, well, they don't care. They, the normal logic and all that stuff, it don't work, but they do have their weaknesses. They fear a lot of different things. They fear being called out on their lies. They fear the biggest thing they fear is being looked at like they're weak, and they won't show remorse or even gratitude, or because that would imply that, like, remorse would imply that you did something wrong. That they never do nothing wrong, and that's ironically enough, for a narcissist thinking he's just the biggest, baddest person in the world, the condition of narcissism actually acts as a learning disability because you can't teach them nothing, to teach, they're never wrong. So how can you correct them? You know what I mean? You can't teach them nothing. So, and I think that's part of what the problem is now. Putin probably at this point has nobody left around him that will say anything to him in any way, and he probably did that on purpose. Same reason why Trump was firing everybody. Same reason why he had, acting this and acting that, he didn't bother with hiring, just put temporary people in there because then they're always under the guillotine of getting fired, and yeah.
Yes, indeed. This is an interesting analysis because I agree, Putin, because of how long he has been in power and how effectively he has repressed meaningful opposition, especially in positions of high office that would have access to him, essentially just has yes men remaining, people who will compliantly carry out his orders. And that is very dangerous because it causes a person to lose the external feedback from reality that could correct or mitigate certain decisions. But Pam had an interesting suggestion in our chat for somebody who could influence Putin effectively, and that is Xi Jinping of China. So, Pam, could you elaborate on that, especially because you've lived in Hong Kong, so you could provide some perspective as to how Xi Jinping operates and perhaps the kind of influence he might have on Putin.
Yeah, Xi Jinping is actually a very skilled negotiator, and he's quite a good ambassador. When he first came into power, there was a lot of tension in the countries in Southeast Asia, which Xi Jinping brought together. He spent many trips to Manila and Indonesia and bringing these countries together and helping do a lot of negotiation of peace. And he's actually, we don't hear a lot about Xi Jinping here in the United States that's favorable, but he's very well thought of in Asia as being a great ambassador. And he's a neighbor to Russia, and he's running the next most powerful country in the world. So if Putin was going to respect anybody, Xi Jinping would be the person he would talk to, in my opinion. And
I would.
yeah, and it's just a matter of what's in it for Xi Jinping. He's watching this play out right now. But yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. What's in it for him, for Z? You know, I mean, I don't think we're willing to give up Taiwan. You know, so, and that's, or the South China Sea, or so. I don't know.
And the other country,
let me throw something there.
You notice that India didn't vote. So India and Russia have been on friendly terms for quite a number of years, going back to the war in Pakistan in the end. So India and the Afghanistan war brought India and Russia closer together. So you have two large countries, India and China. If either one of these countries were to get involved on the side of peace and have some conversation with Putin, I think they would get the audience and they would get his ear more than any of the Western countries.
Yes, excellent thoughts. And Ugochukwu, you wanted to add to this as well.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to add something there as well. What I want to add is simple. I did an online poll here in Nigeria where I asked that if you are the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, what are you going to do at this point in time? Among the many valid options, replies I got were, some people said that surrender to Russia, that they have better armed force. Some said keep fighting, keep on doing what you are doing, keep receiving aid from America and others. Some said, but there was one comment that caught my attention, which I just want to share. Because it aligns with what Pam said in a way, like being an external leader, even though it is highly unorthodox. What I'm gonna say, the person said that Trump should be the envoy of negotiation in the conflict. Trump should be the envoy of negotiation in the conflict. Like, we've seen the UN, like where Ban Ki-moon was there. Sometimes he used to call on Kofi Annan to come and help in negotiations for him. Sometimes you can see presidents asking their predecessors to go for negotiations for them. Since Trump actually got along well with Putin per se, even though some people say that he actually cozied up with dictators, would it not be apt to bring him to negotiate this in the negotiation process of the ceasefire? I don't know, just the suggestion that I got online. I don't know if you can react to it.
It is a very interesting suggestion because clearly Trump is not fond of the war in Ukraine. He has condemned it quite vocally in a speech he made at a rally of his followers.
Yeah, so, he also said USA is stupid and Putin is smart and awesome and all,
But that could be used to our advantage in the negotiations, because then Putin could see, this Trump character, he's not entirely against Russia. He's different in some way. And I don't think Trump actually was an agent of the Putin government. I think the Putin regime thought Trump would be easier to deal with than the Biden administration. So they favored Trump. But
that's quite fair.
There's a big difference between being an agent and being an unwitting agent, or being someone where you put pressure on somebody. It's how mob, he's KGB. It's just how mob works. It's the old story where they, you wake up with a dead hooker and, what am I going to do? And then they come in and, now you owe us. That's how they do it. Putin is a master at that. And Trump was over there in 2014 for the Miss America pageant, and, was all on camera. I'm sure they got something on him. And besides that, he's made a lot of money from him.
Well, but in this case, perhaps Trump could be an unwitting agent for getting Putin to essentially acquiesce to a more peaceful solution. Because, as you pointed out, narcissists could flatter one another, and Trump could flatter Putin, whereas everyone else is condemning Putin. Trump could flatter him and say, well, look, you are this genius leader, but we think that there's a better way than continuing this war. And here are some advantages you can get if you agree to a ceasefire.
Yeah, I think Trump could have, some influence. It's just that they've had this dynamic for so long. I don't know if, Trump has it in him, honestly. Because
it's an interesting question.
But you're right. I think he could if he all of a sudden got his act together, and it's possible.
Yes, and Pam writes in our internal chat, Trump would love to be the hero, and I would share that assessment. Jason writes,
you're right. Yeah.
Jason writes on Xi Jinping, honestly, she might not need anything. China is doing very well already, and they are patient. All she has to do is wait. So I agree. There is no real cause for concern right now that China would invade Taiwan just because Russia invaded Ukraine. It would look very bad in the international community. I think Xi Jinping is the kind of person who values international perception to some extent. So, Pam, do you think that the Chinese government is sufficiently interested in keeping the peace right now that it would actively step in and try to get Putin to de-escalate if this whole talk of nuclear strikes continues?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that they are very interested in having positive public perception and changing the perception of China. I think that she does have a win in this if he were to help negotiate, and his win would be the world perception of him being this benevolent world leader and change the perception of how China is seen. And it is his neighbor. So, Russia and China are two very large countries side by side. So I think I think it would be smart of someone to talk to China, for the UN or someone to speak with them and do some negotiation to get them involved.
If China were to step in and fix the whole situation somehow, people would look at China different. I'm sure they'd be like, "Sweet, way to go, China! All right," that would be a big win for them.
I personally would be happy if any power fix this geopolitical crisis to the point where we would be as unconcerned about nuclear war as we were in, say, 2019. That would be great. And I would say this conversation about the possibility of Chinese interference in the direction of peace actually speaks to the advantages of a multipolar world. We are shifting right now from a bipolar world to a multipolar world, and too many people's mindsets are still stuck in the Cold War, which is one reason why the escalation of tensions between Russia and the United States is so dangerous. A lot of people on both sides still think that it is circa 1965 between the United States and the Soviet Union. And their calculus is the same mentality of mutually assured destruction that existed at that time. But there are a lot of other countries which are in a very different situation. I don't think China adheres to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. It has a much smaller nuclear arsenal than either the United States or Russia. And so it would not win in any nuclear conflict. It would not inflict comparatively nearly as much damage in any nuclear conflict. So China would actually prefer not to be in this situation where an escalation from Russia or an escalation from the United States could lead all of humanity to be destroyed. And likewise, there are other regional powers that are rising. India is another power that was mentioned. India, of course, is a nuclear power as well as is Pakistan, and there's a risk of a local nuclear conflict between those two countries. However, I don't think India has any interest in a global war or a conflict between NATO and Russia. And another regional power is Nigeria within Africa. And I don't think Nigeria would appreciate a world war arising either. So some geopolitical analysts fear a multipolar world, but I actually think that having 5 or 6 superpowers in the world rather than 2 would create greater stability. Because if there is a conflict between any 2 superpowers, then the other 3 or 4 would not be happy about that and could be used to negotiate a peace. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree, man. I mean, just think about it. If it was still a polar, if it was still the Cold War and we was in this situation and there was no China, we wouldn't even have that option. We weren't even thinking about it. But at least that option is maybe there, But if it's just polar, then it's not there. You're right. I agree. Good point.
Yes, indeed. So we are approaching the end of our session today. I really appreciate everyone for sharing your creative and incisive insights on this situation. I would like to ask Art Ramon if you have any thoughts as a result of this conversation that you would like to share, and then we'll go to Ugo Chukwu for some of his closing remarks.
Yeah, I think Putin wants territory, so he's just bluffing about using nukes. He doesn't want to irradiate the territory he wants. So, and also I've heard something about some of these Russian areas there in Ukraine that mistreatment from the Ukraine government because there's a lot of Russian prisoners. So something I heard from a Serbian friend, but that's all.
Yes. And first of all, I would say if Putin is bluffing regarding the use of nuclear weapons, that would be a good outcome. I hope he's bluffing. I do think it needs to be taken seriously because no other world leader essentially has talked that way. Even during the height of the Cold War, the leadership in both the United States and the Soviet Union, at least in terms of public statements, tried to make it very clear they did not want nuclear war. They did not want escalation. Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis actively exchanged letters, written correspondence, in which they laid out their views very clearly, but they were both aimed toward de-escalation. So a lot less belligerent in their rhetoric than Putin has been. And that's what troubles me. It may well be a bluff. I would agree that that's a possibility, but even in being a bluff, it would be an unprecedented kind of action. But with regard to the situation where a lot of ethnic Russians do feel that there has been unjust treatment of them in Ukraine, that's very true as well. And if you ask many people in the Donbass region, they do feel that they've been marginalized. They are very upset that for 8 years, there has been a low-level state of war between their self-proclaimed republics and the Ukrainian government. And a lot of civilians have suffered. Their economy has suffered. Their region, which used to be one of the most prosperous in Ukraine, became an economic backwater. And while the majority of Ukrainians do not have neo-Nazi attitudes, there is a battalion called the Azov Battalion that is comprised of active neo-Nazis, which have been active in that region. So that is important to consider as well. It's not a black and white type of situation. It's not a situation where one side is unambiguously good and the other side is unambiguously evil. Unfortunately, innocent people on both sides are suffering, and that is quite tragic. But now I would like to give the last word to Ugochukwu. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insights today. How would you like to conclude this session? What closing thoughts would you wish to offer?
Opportunity to conclude. Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity to conclude the session. I will simply say that more than ever before, the world is really challenged. Since the end of the Cold War, we have been this particular war between Russia and Ukraine has challenged the moral resolve of the world. And that is why the work that we do here at Transhumanist is actually very good. This hour in history actually need a dedicated circle of transhumanists, because as our planet now teeters on the brink of atomic annihilation and nuclear threat, and with the issue of the clashes of ego and dangerous passion with hatred and deranged egomaniacs at the affairs of nations, like you have seen North Korea and Russia and others. So the saving of this world will actually come not from these politicians, but from the work that transhumanists have done. People who have resolved, as Toru said, to dedicate improved means to an improved end. Dedicate the best of humanity to improving humanity. And to people of Ukraine, like I said before, my heart goes out with you. And as people resolve to defend your country, then you people should keeping on. Then to the politicians that are in charge of the dialogue and negotiation process, we should find a way together with Russia and the allies or whoever to ensure that a ceasefire agreement comes in effect in earnest. And then the political solution can work out from there. But in a special way, I want to thank the Transhumanist Party. Like I said earlier, the progress we need in terms of reduction of nuclear stockpiles, in terms of the great advances in medicine, in terms of the improvement of the human life and all that we need, are not going to come from the people that have been running the affairs of the world. It's going to come from transhumanists, people who have resolved to really devote the best of mankind to making the best of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ugochukwu. I'm honored by those good words from you, and certainly the Transhumanist Party shall strive to the utmost to achieve the objectives that you described. We stand strongly in support of de-escalation, nuclear disarmament, and peace, and the advancement of science, technology, longevity, and the moral progress of humanity so that we don't have these kinds of terrible conflicts anymore. I appreciate the insights of all of our panelists today, Pam, Sharif, Jason, Art Ramon. This was an excellent discussion, in part because we have the ability to provide the kinds of unique insights that no other organization, no other group of people can arrive at. We have cultivated such a distinctive environment here at the Virtual Enlightenment Salons and within the transhumanist community more generally, that we are focused on constructive, creative, outside the box types of solutions to pressing problems. And I think those are the kinds of solutions that will be needed to overcome the dire crisis that the world faces today. So until next week, let's hope that humankind lasts until then, and we all live long and prosper.
Thank you.